Here we go. Take 5. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Punk Write. My name is Smee. You know, writing stories is a very complex process. Not complicated, this is complicated. And in this case, the for itself affirms itself as not being this past which it posits. The past is no longer behind, it does not cease being past, but I myself cease to be the past. That's complicated. As a philosophy major, I've always felt obliged to read Sartre, and I've tried to read that thing 3 times. I have no idea what the hell he's saying. The difference between complicated and complex is that complexity can be divided into simpler parts, and that is very good for us as authors, because if we understand the simpler parts of a story, we know better how to assemble them to take us all the way to the end to create something that is quality. Understanding story structure is not a new challenge for us. In fact, it dates all the way back to Aristotle and Aristotle's pyramid in terms of looking at the progress of the tragic hero. In the 19th century, this was revised by Freytag, and we know it commonly today as Freytag's pyramid. Now, Freytag's pyramid is a very useful structure to be able to think about plot structures, but sometimes I believe it's a little bit oversimplified. Still, you should do your investigation, go to YouTube, check it out, and learn a little bit about it. But today I'm just going to give you some basic overviews so that we can talk about things that I believe are missing from the pyramid and not talked about enough. Freytag's pyramid is often looked at in 2 different ways. You can look at it as a 3-act structure or a 5-act structure. The 3-act structure I think is the greatest utility because it easily overlays with the hero's journey. I've done another video on the hero's journey, and some of the diagrams that you'll see in both this video and the other shows how that relationship works in conjunction with the pyramid and the journey itself. The first part, or the protasis, is the introductory part. It's the prologue that kind of gives us the movement and the introduction to the conflict itself. The middle part, or the epitasis, is the trial for the hero that takes us all the way up to the climax and leads into the third part, which is the catastrophe or the catastasis. Within that, you can also look at 5 different chunks, those chunks being the introduction, the conflict, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the denouement. Those 5 parts are often looked at as 5 acts in themselves. I find this a little more complicated, but hey, whatever works for you. Now, I don't read a whole lot of fantasy, but I recently chunked my way through Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, and it's a good read. I would recommend it. It kept my interest all the way through, and he really does a good job of breaking it up into 5 different parts, and those 5 parts really emulate the 5-act structure pretty closely. It's a good lesson. Gotta have a little bit of patience. It's thick. What is often left out of looking at this structure, particularly for writers in terms of a utility for how to put stories together, is the corresponding conflicts. Now, I'm going to step away from the pyramid because it's hard to understand the pyramid, particularly the climax of where that pyramid is leading, if you don't have a strong grasp of the types of conflicts and how you're actually using those conflicts within your story. So let's get into some of the major conflict archetypes that exist. As we go through this, however, it's important to keep in mind that the world that you've created for your story and for your characters has an important role in terms of defining these conflicts and from where they arise. Worlds often define the conflict, so you can't really work one without the other. Take, for example, the first one, individual versus society. Now, individual versus society is a very difficult, ambiguous, and nebulous type of conflict to deal with because you can't really have one individual, or in rare cases do you have one individual dealing with an entire social confrontation. Usually that confrontation is represented by one single antagonist, and that antagonist holds a certain position in terms of the perspective of society. This is apparent in the book Ready Player One because you have the main antagonist who is representative of a corporation, and that corporation is a larger society that your protagonist is struggling against. In the second type of conflict, individual versus technology, you have a similar type of relationship. Technologies are born from the societies that create them. Now, it's difficult to struggle against a specific technology, so that you have some representative that is kind of demonstrative of what this technology means and how it creates conflict for your protagonist. I, Robot by Isaac Asimov is an excellent example, as well as I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. Both of those create worlds that are dominated by technological error, and those in turn create conflicts for your protagonists. Thirdly, you have individual versus the self. Now, these are important types of conflicts that on some aspect all stories are going to have for your character. And character arcs are often built with these internal struggles. Frodo and Samwise in Lord of the Rings are fantastic examples, and these culminate at the end along with the major conflict of the actual ring, which is something that dominates the story itself. In individual versus nature, you have external struggles that are dominating the conflicts for your character. These are often interesting types of conflicts because nature, which is this big concept, has many tentacles in which it can manipulate the conflicts of your protagonist. Tom Hanks in Castaway is a great example of this. You get battered by the winds, you get battered by the ocean, you get battered by hunger. All of these obstacles create a very interesting character arc across the storyline. Lastly, you have individual versus supernatural. Now, this can be sometime broken up into two different parts. You'll see it as individual versus the gods, and this is apparent in Greek tragedies. Percy Jackson takes advantage of these and uses the role of the gods to incorporate protagonist conflict. One of my favorite, of course, is The Truman Show. If you've not seen The Truman Show, whether you're a fan of Jim Carrey or not, go check it out. These are great supernatural and godlike conflicts that are created on your characters that really force them to confront superior aspects of themselves as a character. In all of these stories that I've just mentioned, there is always an interplay of a multiplicity of conflicts. However, it is extremely important as the author to keep in mind that there is one main conflict that is going to bring me to the climax of the story. Your job as the author is to make sure that that principal climax corresponds to the principal conflict. The skill is taking all of the sub-conflicts that are wrapped around that and bringing them together and tying up those loose ends. If you can do it all in the climax, that is fantastic. But usually some of those are retained for the denouement. And this brings us to the last part that we want to look at in terms of the utility of Freytag's pyramid for us as writers. The second act of Freytag's pyramid looks at the beginning of the conflict and takes us all the way up to the climax. And we should pay special attention to this because this is actually the most interesting part of your story where your character demonstrates who he or she is. Often, this line is represented as a straight line that takes us from one point to the next in that second act, but that's an oversimplification of what actually happens during that second act. A true demonstration of that progression should look like a saw with jagged edges, many ups and downs. And those ups and downs are actually individual scenes that you can construct as an author to plot out your story. Look at those individual ups and downs of the jagged edge as mini scenes, and those mini scenes have their own climaxes and their own advancements in the story. And pay special attention to that big jagged edge here, which is the actual near-death experience. Those are quite interesting, and those scenes are hugely important because it allows your character to come out with some greater strength so that they can be successful at the major conflict. So what you're doing as an author as you create all of these ups and downs is really conceiving of obstacles that your character has to overcome to either move the plot along or to demonstrate who they are as characters so that when they get to the climax of the story, they're prepared to defeat the antagonism of whatever is driving that story. I find this very useful as an author because you can take all of those complex progressions of your conflicts and your main conflict as well as your sub-conflicts and break it down into smaller chunks so you can conceive how you want to put those together to move your story along. So I encourage you to look at and use Freytag's pyramid as a plot structuring device because it can be quite useful, but go beyond just the superficiality of the pyramid and look at the complexities of those conflicts and how they work together to create interesting stories and culminate into an important climax. In all of our conversations today, I will say that Freytag's pyramid works best if you have only one main character. Having multiple main characters or multiple heroes creates different demands on the author and different complexities. I'll be creating a subsequent video on this in terms of parallel plot structures. If you're looking for some good guidance on this, I would suggest City of Thieves by David Benioff. He's done writing for Game of Thrones, he's written multiple novels, but this one in particular has a very clean hero structure with great sub-conflicts that are quite easy to follow and come together in a very clean way. That's it for today on Punk Write. Thanks for joining us, and remember, you don't need anyone's permission, just write. Punk Write.